It's strange how life works. One moment, a person is a living, breathing child, filled with laughter and dreams. And in the next, they are reduced to nothing more than a cold, unfeeling gravestone and fading memories. Timothy Q. Calto Jr. was one such soul. Those who loved him dearly had once called him Timmy, an energetic boy of 6 with an endless spirit and a boundless imagination. While other children dreamed of riches, fancy cars, and grand futures, all Timmy ever wanted was to stay a boy forever, to play without a care in the world. And in a cruel twist of fate, he had gotten his wish. Timmy had died in 1920, taken by the merciless grip of tuberculosis, a disease that had stolen thousands of lives. Now, for years later, his family stood solemnly at his grave, their hearts heavy with grief. His mother, father, and sister, Rosemary, huddled together, their sobs lost in the whispering winds that brushed through the cemetery. Rosemary, only 10 years old the last time she had seen him, still remembered his face clearly, his bright, twinkling green eyes, his mop of wild blonde hair that he always refused to brush. She imagined him now, just beyond the tombstone, playing in the fields of the afterlife, as free as he had always wished to be. "Whatever he's doing," she murmured through trembling lips, "I know he's not resting in peace. He's playing. He has to be." Her mother gasped in horror. "What a thing to say, Rosemary," Mrs. Calto scolded, clutching her husband's arm. "What a terrible thing to say." She broke into fresh sobs, and Mr. Calstock held her close, casting a disapproving look at Rosemary. The young girl bit her lip, feeling guilty, but deep down, she couldn't shake the thought. She would rather believe that Timmy was still playing, still laughing, than accept the cold, grim reality of him being buried beneath the weight of damp earth and wilted flowers. Just as she opened her mouth to apologize, a sharp cough tore from her chest. It was not the first. It had been happening for weeks now. Mr. Calstock sighed heavily, concern darkening his features. "That's enough. I've let this go on too long. I'm calling Dr. MCD tonight," he declared. Mrs. Calstock wiped her eyes and nodded. "Yes, something must be done." Rosemary turned her gaze back to the gravestone, a deep unease settling in her stomach. She had been coughing a lot lately. Coughing was one of the symptoms of... No, she didn't even want to think of the name. "Do you think I have what Timmy had?" she asked suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. Her parents exchanged a glance. They didn't answer, and that silence told her everything she needed to know. The next morning, Dr. MCD arrived at the Calstock household. Rosemary sat still as he examined her, feeling her forehead, checking her throat, listening to her lungs. His brow furrowed as he worked, his questions seemingly endless. Her stomach twisted into knots. She already knew the truth. Finally, Dr. MCD sighed and turned to her parents. "May I speak with the two of you?" he asked. "In private." Mrs. Calstock turned pale. Mr. Calstock clenched his jaw. Rosemary felt as if a cold hand had gripped her heart. She knew, even before her parents left the room, before they whispered behind closed doors, before her mother's choked sob filled the air. She knew. Tuberculosis. Just like Timmy. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Rosemary sat in her room, staring out the window, wondering if her fate had already been sealed. The next morning, she would be taken to Waverly Hills Sanatorium, the very same place where Timmy had died. Waverly Hills Sanatorium loomed over the Kentucky hills like a silent, watchful beast. The massive, red-bricked structure stood as a monument to suffering, its long hallways stretching into darkness like the winding tunnels of the underworld. When Rosemary first arrived, she clung to the hope that this place would make her better, that the doctors and nurses were here to help. But hope did not last long at Waverly. The moment she stepped through the iron gates, she felt it. The weight, the unseen presence that lingered in the air, suffocating and cold. The sanatorium was filled with the sick, children, women, and men alike, all suffering from the same disease that had taken Timmy. They sat in their beds, wrapped in thin blankets, coughing violently into rags stained with blood. The halls reeked of antiseptic and sickness, a smell so strong it clawed at her throat. Her days quickly fell into a routine. Each morning, she was given a tasteless, grayish breakfast, usually some cold oatmeal or stale bread, followed by a sharp, stinging injection in her arm. The doctors would check her, their hands cold and impersonal, their expressions blank as they poked and prodded her frail body. And then there were the treatments, the unbearable sun therapy, where they forced her to lie in the cold air for hours, bundled in blankets, as if fresh air alone could cure her. The painful lung exercises, the endless swallowing of foul-tasting tonics. But at night, the real horrors began. Rosemary quickly learned that Waverly had its own sounds after dark. The halls were quiet, yet never silent. The wind howled through the broken windows, carrying faint whispers with it, voices that did not belong to the living. Sometimes, she heard the crying. Not the quiet sobs of frightened patients, but something else, something unnatural. The weeping of someone who no longer had lungs to breathe, of a soul forever trapped in agony. And worse still were the footsteps. At first, she assumed they belonged to the night nurses, making their rounds. But these steps did not match the slow, measured pace of a nurse. They were light, quick, like the hurried pattering of a child running barefoot through the halls. One night, as Rosemary lay curled in her bed, she heard the sound again. The soft, quick steps moving down the hall, pausing at certain rooms before continuing. Then, they stopped, right outside her door. Her heart pounded as she squeezed her eyes shut, pulling the thin hospital sheet over her head. For a long moment, there was silence. And then, tap, tap, a knock at her door. Soft, childlike, a sound that made the hairs on the back of her neck rise. She held her breath. Tap, tap, a little stronger this time. Rosemary bit down on her lip, stifling the cry rising in her throat. Then, the door creaked open, just a few inches. A sliver of darkness from the hallway spilled into the room. She lay motionless, staring at the open door, her body frozen in place. A shadow moved just beyond the threshold. A small figure, child-sized. Rosemary felt a lump rise in her throat. "Timmy," she whispered. No answer. The shadow stood there, silent, watching. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The door swung shut with a quiet click. For the rest of the night, Rosemary lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint sound of footsteps retreating down the hall. Rosemary did not wait for morning. As soon as the first rays of moonlight touched her windowsill, she threw off her blankets and crept out of bed. She had to find a place to hide. Dr. Cantrell was planning to operate on her. She had overheard him telling Nurse Alice about his special surgery, a surgery that involved inserting a balloon into her lung and inflating it. She shuddered at the thought. She needed to disappear, and she knew just the place. The children's playroom. It was one of the few places in the sanatorium that still carried traces of warmth, of life. The nurses rarely checked it at night, leaving it untouched, frozen in time. As she tiptoed through the dark hallways, she tried not to look into the empty patient rooms, afraid she might see something looking back. Finally, she reached the door of the playroom and slipped inside. The air inside was heavy with dust, the scent of old wood and forgotten laughter lingering in the space. Toys lay scattered across the floor, wooden blocks, stuffed animals with missing eyes, tiny metal cars rusted with time. And in the farthest corner of the room, there it was, a single red ball. Her breath caught in her throat. It looked exactly like Timmy's, the very same ball he used to kick around their yard, the one he never left behind. No matter where he went, tears pricked at her eyes as she whispered, "Timmy?" For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, the ball moved. It rolled across the wooden floor, stopping just at her feet. Her heart hammered against her ribs. "Timmy, is that you?" she whispered. She reached down and picked up the ball, its surface worn and smooth beneath her fingers. Then, with a shaking hand, she rolled it back toward the corner. The ball slowed to a stop. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. And then, it came rolling back. Rosemary let out a soft sob, covering her mouth with her hands. It was him. It had to be. She sat down, rolling the ball back and forth, each toss carrying an unspoken memory between them. They played for what felt like hours, just like they used to, just like before. Then, at last, she swallowed the lump in her throat and whispered, "Timmy, if Dr. Cantrell hurt you, roll the ball back to me." The ball stilled. A heavy silence settled over the room. Then, as if yanked by an unseen force, the ball shot forward, slamming into her hands. Rosemary gasped, clutching it tightly to her chest. Tears streamed down her cheeks. "I love you, little brother," she sobbed. "We'll get back at that monster. I promise." As the first light of dawn crept through the window, Rosemary felt a strange warmth surround her. A final embrace, a whispered goodbye, and then, all at once, everything went cold. She did not see morning. She did not see the operating table, but Dr. Cantrell did. When he arrived at the playroom, he found only the red ball sitting in the center of the floor. The door slammed shut behind him. The window rattled violently, and then the giggles started. Soft, innocent, childlike, and then his screams. Screams that would echo through Waverly Hills for eternity. Some say, even now, if you listen closely, you can still hear them. The bounce of a ball, the laughter of a child, and the desperate, terrified cries of a man who would never leave. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification button for more stories.